Oh, hello, I'm Peter Cox from the University of Chester, and this is one of two linked presentations to this CSRG symposium. I put them together before I realised the obvious connection with the UCU campaign, Decolonize and Decarbonize. I put them together because they're two ideas that I feel that are quite strongly linked and need to be linked. And in this one, I want to think on the one hand about research, and this includes its practical mechanics and some of the philosophical background. It's something we all do, and so I'm going to assume a fair degree of familiarity. The other task is something I'll assume less familiarity with, and it's the issues around decolonisation, the insights that emerge out of the broader conversation on decolonising universities. And I'm going to assume slightly less familiarity with this. So anybody who's steeped in it, turn away now. But I know I had to do a lot of new reading when I was enrolled onto a working group to explore decolonisation in relation to my own institution's work. And I've got a PhD based in post-colonial theory, so I kind of thought I was relatively well versed. So the aim of this presentation is to first see how in our research as cycling researchers, we might join in with the broader tasks of decolonising universities. And second, to examine some of the challenges that agenda poses to our research, our topics, our methods, our methodological assumptions. I'll deliberately be asking a lot more questions than providing answers. And I reiterate all the way through, keep reminding yourself, none of this is taken as accusation. It should be an opportunity for reflection. So let's start. Research is something we all do as academics. And this is something I use to explain the process to my undergraduates taking their first steps into independent research. And nowadays, of course, that initial review of the literature, step 2 here, it's expanded by the huge multiplication of publishing possibilities, only possibly searched through digital access. For me, keyword and phrase searches, snowballing, other techniques produces a vast pile of downloaded material that then has to be read, noted, sorted. And I've noted that I'm always looking at this and thinking about it on at least 2 levels simultaneously. First, I'm obviously identifying ideas, material, concepts that relate to my general topic. But at the same time, I find myself observing patterns and themes emerging from a bigger picture that tell me something about the favoured methods, the analytical tools used, which sources and topics are currently fashionable, all those sorts of things. But before going on to think about the next steps in research, I want to take a step backwards to ask some reflective questions. When we define the problem, as on the previous slide, and when we move to devise a research question, it's worth stopping to reflect. These are questions have no predefined or right answers. How we respond to them, however, will shape and define the tasks we set ourselves and the means through which we conduct them. In my own case, becoming involved with a decolonising working group has caused me to think a little more deeply on them. And let's look at this, why this might be. Because in the next few slides, I want to look at some of the material that's emerged from this working group in decolonising academia, decolonising education. First, it's not a matter of historical revisionism. Neither is the decolonising agenda a blank sheet which we can interpret any way we like. When we become engaged in this process, we're joining a long-standing body of reflection that's thinking about the legacy of academia. And as Baker 2012 explains, in order to build a universal conception of knowledge, Western epistemology, from Christian theology to secular philosophy and science, has pretended that knowledge is independent of the geohistorical particularly Christian Europe, and biographical conditions, Christian white men living in Christian Europe in which it's produced. The inheritance of the European university, therefore, is as a repository and a reproducer of that model of knowledge. And the colonial legacy is also visible in the world beyond teaching and learning processes, by which the university provides a channel for upward mobility within a hierarchical system without ever questioning that structure. So that we're constantly engaged in something which reproduces colonial visions of the world and colonial forms of knowledge. So what's a challenge going to look like? A decolonizing university is a project of transformation, a transformative space and a force for transformation. And these insights are all taken from our summary document. Please email me if you want a copy of this. And they provide tools to make those reflections that I suggested in slide 3. What we need to ask ourselves is how much, in what ways do our own research practice contribute to, or conversely, struggle with these ways of thinking? Now, obviously, part of our what I find inspiring is that some of the things that we're doing in cycling research, some of the things that I see are already thinking about how to contribute to this agenda. The idea of the embodied knowledge and sensory bodies is really, really, really important. And technocratic struggles are obviously under question here. And when we, as I'm not going to read all these slides out, that's why they're there. But I'm just going to ask, or get us to think about what shapes our research, and what shapes will our research need to take these imperatives into account. For example, and this is a particularly key one, I think, what would our relations with research participants look like if those participants are to be treated realistically as co-producers of knowledge rather than just data subjects or sources of information to be mined? How much do our research practices depend on kind of the extraction of information from sources and people, as reducing people to sources of information? And then when we reproduce that information, when we write up, what does that look like? Who does it create? And if we move away from the cognitive aspects of the decolonizing program, we're also thinking about space. A decolonizing university is not just a way of gathering knowledge, it is a location in which knowledge is the primary currency. And so that we need to kind of think about how this will work. What are the spaces that we create? The physical spaces and the cognitive spaces as well. And how do we address those? There are implications for the bricks and mortar of the institutions we work in, and the relationships with those around outside of those institutions themselves. So we'll come back here just to think about the implications for our research, to summarize these and the reflections on what we do as researchers and beginning to ask different questions. So I'm sure we're all committed to cycling studies as a step to the production of a better world, but do we consistently apply this, not only to the outcomes of the work, but the ways which we approach it? An example comes from several papers I've read recently, and I'm not going to name names. That would be invidious and accusatory, and unfair. But questions that we need to kind of ask is, where do we draw our boundaries? Do we assume national boundaries as natural, or specific regional or national identities in our work? What's that saying? How were those created in the first place? What maintains them? What reproduces them? Does that affect, for example, what we see as legitimate and illegitimate behaviours? Legitimate and illegitimate ways of knowing? When we study existing behaviours, do we take into account the forces that are already at work to limit people's behaviour? Or do we make an assumption that they're entirely free neoliberal choice-making agents? If we're doing the latter, we're already reproducing a colonial process, assuming that or ignoring the geohistorical realities that we inherit, whether those are of privilege or of disprivilege. So do we take into sufficient account the operation of forces of coloniality operating in the scenarios we investigate? And coloniality is not just colonial history here, but the processes by which colonial mindset is reproduced. Do we just look at cycling in isolation, or do we see it as one of the many activities to understand the place of mobility in wider life? For example, how do we place ourselves as the producers and holders of knowledge? So we need to ask seriously all along if our only justification is to find a single solution. Are we actually kind of saying, well, this is the way that you must live, or we must all live? Where's this in terms of the colonial discourse? And a final caveat, that this is not a pursuit of utilitarianism research, arguing that the only legitimate studies are those that directly contribute to narratives of liberation. In fact, it's the opposite of a utilitarian approach. There's nothing so liberating from the restriction, from a life restricted to necessity, than something gratuitous. What is, do we have space for gratuitous knowledge? Because knowledge, this applies to knowledge as much as it does to material goods. So whose ultimate ends does knowledge production research serve? And final application, I did say it would be more questions and answers. I'd like to think I'm fairly diligent in my reading of the literature of cycling studies, and I've shared these because they're questions that arise as I reflect on the patterns in the literature. And I've deliberately, as I say, kept to generalizations to avoid being accusatory. That helps no one. So this is my takeaway question, mostly to myself, but one I wanted to share. Because one thing I've come to notice recently in the process of my current research project is that an awful lot of what's important about cycling is actually nothing to do with cycling. The effects of cycling do not end up changing cycling. And the converse holds true. An awful lot of what's important for cycling has nothing to do with cycling. Investigating cycling won't tell you about those forces, the things that affect cycling. Obviously, this makes cycling studies a little more difficult, but hopefully it pushes us to connect further across boundaries. And I hope that this can be a start of a longer dialogue around decarbonising and decolonising in cycling research. As I say, get in touch if you want to continue the conversation. Thanks very much.